My name is Rachel Mercer. I was 41 years old when I stepped out of St. Vincent Medical Center with a plastic hospital wristband still tight around my arm, a stitched incision pulling at my side, and saw a white real estate sign planted in my mother's front yard with a red sold rider swinging under it. My mother, Evelyn Mercer, was 83. She was sitting in her own living room in a cardigan buttoned wrong, looking at two strangers wrap her wedding china in paper, while my sister Dana stood in the doorway with a clipboard and told me I should have stayed one more night at the hospital if I was going to make a scene. I still had the brass house key hanging from the faded blue ribbon my father tied to it 15 years earlier. I remember because the ribbon was damp in my hand. I had been clutching it the whole drive. Dana looked at the key, then at me, and smiled the way people smile when they think paperwork has already buried you. She said, "You don't need that anymore. Mom agreed to the sale yesterday." I did not yell. I did not ask the movers to stop. I stood on that front walk in soft discharge slippers, looked past Dana at my mother's face, and knew in 1 second that nothing happening inside that house had happened clean. My mother had the flat, startled expression she got whenever too many voices came at her at once. She was not confused enough to lose herself. She was just old enough to be cornered by speed. Dana mistook the fact that I was pale, sore, and quiet for weakness. That was the first mistake. The second was assuming the house on Sycamore Lane belonged to our mother in the simple way she kept telling everyone it did. The third, and the one that ended everything for her, was missing one signature. I am a payroll supervisor at Franklin Community College in Dayton, Ohio. For 16 years, I have spent my workdays reconciling numbers that other people overlook, tracing small mistakes back to the person who made them, and fixing problems before they become disasters. My flaw, if I am honest, is that I have always believed facts eventually expose people on their own. I wait longer than I should before accusing anybody of anything because I keep hoping they will correct themselves once the truth is in front of them. That habit cost me peace more than once. It also kept me from making stupid moves that would have helped Dana. By the time this happened, I had been divorced for 7 years, lived 11 minutes from my mother, and knew exactly how many pills were in the tray beside her bed, how much her property taxes were every April, and which floorboard in the upstairs hallway still clicked, because my father never got around to replacing it before his lungs failed. Dana knew none of those things. Dana knew square footage, resale language, granite trends, and how to make neglect sound like efficiency. She was 38 then, 4 years younger than me, beautifully turned out, always 10 shades more polished than the room required. If she came over to help our mother, it was never for long. She came in boots that had never seen mud, kissed our mother on the cheek, opened curtains that my mother had closed because afternoon light bothered her eyes, and talked about next steps. She worked as a sales coordinator for a regional home staging company and liked to hint that she was basically in real estate, which was true only if you also thought handing someone a brochure made you a surgeon. Dana had spent the last 2 years saying my mother's house was dead equity, and that it was selfish of me to encourage an old woman to stay in a 2-story home full of maintenance. What she really meant was that the house sat on a 1/4 acre in a neighborhood that had been climbing in value, and she had already converted it into imaginary money in her head. At first, even her worst behavior came wrapped in reason. She would say, "Mom can't keep managing stairs forever," and that was true. She would say, "A paid facility would be safer if something happened in the night," and that was also true in the abstract. What she left out was that our mother did not want to leave, that she was managing with the stair rail my father installed, and the walk-in shower I paid to add after her second fall, and that every proposal Dana made somehow positioned Dana near a check. She suggested we sell the house and split management of the money. She suggested transferring our mother's car into her own name because she was handling errands anyway. She suggested a financial power of attorney that she drafted from an online template and tried to slide across the table after Sunday lunch. When our mother hesitated, Dana laughed and said I was making everybody paranoid by treating forms like loaded guns. I need to slow down here because people who only see the final confrontation miss how it was built. Nothing in my life trained me to be dramatic. I was trained to be useful. As a payroll supervisor in Dayton, my days were made of receipts, signatures, dates, benefit forms, appointment calendars, and the kind of small corrections no one praises until the correction saves them from ruin. That habit followed me home. I kept folders because I had learned that memory becomes a weak witness the moment a confident person starts denying it. I wrote down phone calls. I saved envelopes. I photographed objects before they disappeared from tables. I was not preparing for war. I was trying to keep ordinary life from being rewritten by the person who spoke fastest. That is what Dana never understood about me. Quiet people are not always passive. Sometimes we are simply gathering the part of the story that will still be standing after everyone else has exhausted their performance. I also learned that money changes shape depending on who is speaking. When they needed me small, $412,000 cash offer was just numbers, just practical, just what any reasonable family would do. When I questioned it, the same money became sacred. It became legacy, sacrifice, survival, duty, blood. The shift was so fast that it would have confused me if I had not written down the earlier version. That is why records matter. A record captures the first lie before the second one arrives dressed as principle. People sometimes ask why I did not expose everything sooner. The answer is simple. Exposure before proof gives a liar time to rehearse. It teaches them which part of the lie needs reinforcement. It lets them recruit witnesses and make you look unstable before anyone sees the documents. So I waited. Waiting did not mean doing nothing. Waiting meant making sure every page was legible, every copy was stored, and every person with authority at Buckeye Title heard the facts in the right order. That kind of restraint is exhausting. It is also the only reason the final room belonged to the truth, instead of to whoever cried first. The small human moments were the ones that stayed with me most. The way the blue ribbon key felt heavier after the truth came out. The way a stranger lowered their voice when they realized the story was not gossip. The way my mother Evelyn became a full person again, the moment the room stopped treating my mother Evelyn as a problem to be solved. Even in a legal or financial fight, dignity is physical. You can see it return to a person's shoulders. You can hear it in the first complete sentence they speak after being interrupted for years. By the time I drove home, Dayton looked ordinary again. Cars moved through intersections. Someone was mowing a lawn, a woman carried groceries with a toddler pulling at her sleeve. Nothing outside had changed, and that almost made me angry. I had lived through an earthquake inside a room, and the world still had the nerve to look normal. Then I realized that was part of the gift. The world had not ended, the lie had. Those are different things. A family myth can collapse, and the sun can still hit the sidewalk. You can lose the illusion of belonging, and still have somewhere to go. There is another part I could not have explained while it was happening. I was grieving two things at once. The obvious wound, and the old fantasy that someone in my family would eventually choose decency without being forced. That fantasy is stubborn. It survives insults. It survives exclusions. It even survives public humiliation, because the heart keeps looking for the person it hoped was hiding under the behavior. I looked for that person in Dana for years. I looked for hesitation, regret, one private sentence that proved the cruelty had limits. What I found instead was calculation. Not genius. Calculation. The kind that depends on everyone else being embarrassed enough to stay quiet. I also learned that money changes shape depending on who is speaking. When they needed me small, $412,000 cash offer was just numbers, just practical, just what any reasonable family would do. When I questioned it, the same money became sacred. It became legacy, sacrifice, survival, duty, blood. The shift was so fast that it would have confused me if I had not written down the earlier version. That is why records matter. A record captures the first lie before the second one arrives dressed as principle. People sometimes ask why I did not expose everything sooner. The answer is simple. Exposure before proof gives a liar time to rehearse. It teaches them which part of the lie needs reinforcement. It lets them recruit witnesses and make you look unstable before anyone sees the documents. So I waited. Waiting did not mean doing nothing. Waiting meant making sure every page was legible, every copy was stored, and every person with authority at Buckeye Title heard the facts in the right order. That kind of restraint is exhausting. It is also the only reason the final room belonged to the truth, instead of to whoever cried first. The small human moments were the ones that stayed with me most. The way the blue ribbon key felt heavier after the truth came out. The way a stranger lowered their voice when they realized the story was not gossip. The way my mother Evelyn became a full person again the moment the room stopped treating my mother Evelyn as a problem to be solved. Even in a legal or financial fight, dignity is physical. You can see it return to a person's shoulders. You can hear it in the first complete sentence they speak after being interrupted for years. By the time I drove home, Dayton looked ordinary again. Cars moved through intersections. Someone was mowing a lawn. A woman carried groceries with a toddler pulling at her sleeve. Nothing outside had changed, and that almost made me angry. I had lived through an earthquake inside a room, and the world still had the nerve to look normal. Then I realized that was part of the gift. The world had not ended. The lie had. Those are different things. A family myth can collapse and the sun can still hit the sidewalk. You can lose the illusion of belonging and still have somewhere to go. There is another part I could not have explained while it was happening. I was grieving two things at once: the obvious wound and the old fantasy that someone in my family would eventually choose decency without being forced. That fantasy is stubborn. It survives insults. It survives exclusions. It even survives public humiliation, because the heart keeps looking for the person it hoped was hiding under the behavior. I looked for that person in Dana for years. I looked for hesitation, regret, one private sentence that proved the cruelty had limits. What I found instead was calculation. Not genius. Calculation. The kind that depends on everyone else being embarrassed enough to stay quiet. If you are the son or daughter carrying the appointments, passwords, pill lists, property tax calendar, and emotional labor everybody else likes to criticize from a distance, hear me plainly. Your caution is not cruelty. Your documentation is not paranoia. Your refusal to rush is not selfishness. Do not surrender your clarity because somebody louder or more charming says you are overreacting. Check the title. Read the trust. Call the attorney. Keep the key. And if this story hit something real in you, tell me in the comments what role you have carried in your family. The peacekeeper, the fixer, the scapegoat, the one who handles the paperwork, or the one who finally said no. Share this with someone who needs the reminder that calm is not weakness, and that sometimes one missing signature is the line between dignity and theft. By the time I drove home, Dayton looked ordinary again. Cars moved through intersections. Someone was mowing a lawn. A woman carried groceries with a toddler pulling at her sleeve. Nothing outside had changed, and that almost made me angry. I had lived through an earthquake inside a room, and the world still had the nerve to look normal. Then I realized that was part of the gift. The world had not ended. The lie had. Those are different things. A family myth can collapse and the sun can still hit the sidewalk. You can lose the illusion of belonging and still have somewhere to go. There is another part I could not have explained while it was happening. I was grieving two things at once: the obvious wound and the old fantasy that someone in my family would eventually choose decency without being forced. That fantasy is stubborn. It survives insults. It survives exclusions. It even survives public humiliation, because the heart keeps looking for the person it hoped was hiding under the behavior. I looked for that person in Dana for years. I looked for hesitation, regret, one private sentence that proved the cruelty had limits. What I found instead was calculation. Not genius. Calculation. The kind that depends on everyone else being embarrassed enough to stay quiet. I also learned that money changes shape depending on who is speaking. When they needed me small, $412,000 cash offer was just numbers, just practical, just what any reasonable family would do. When I questioned it, the same money became sacred. It became legacy, sacrifice, survival, duty, blood. The shift was so fast that it would have confused me if I had not written down the earlier version. That is why records matter. A record captures the first lie before the second one arrives, dressed as principle. People sometimes ask why I did not expose everything sooner. The answer is simple. Exposure before proof gives a liar time to rehearse. It teaches them which part of the lie needs reinforcement. It lets them recruit witnesses and make you look unstable before anyone sees the documents. So I waited. Waiting did not mean doing nothing. Waiting meant making sure every page was legible, every copy was stored, and every person with authority at Buckeye Title heard the facts in the right order. That kind of restraint is exhausting. It is also the only reason the final room belonged to the truth instead of to whoever cried first. The small human moments were the ones that stayed with me most. The way the blue ribbon key felt heavier after the truth came out. The way a stranger lowered their voice when they realized the story was not gossip. The way my mother Evelyn became a full person again, the moment the room stopped treating my mother Evelyn as a problem to be solved. Even in a legal or financial fight, dignity is physical. You can see it return to a person's shoulders. You can hear it in the first complete sentence they speak after being interrupted for years. By the time I drove home, Dayton looked ordinary again. Cars moved through intersections. Someone was mowing a lawn. A woman carried groceries with a toddler pulling at her sleeve. Nothing outside had changed, and that almost made me angry. I had lived through an earthquake inside a room, and the world still had the nerve to look normal. Then I realized that was part of the gift. The world had not ended. The lie had. Those are different things. A family myth can collapse and the sun can still hit the sidewalk. You can lose the illusion of belonging and still have somewhere to go. There is another part I could not have explained while it was happening. I was grieving two things at once. The obvious wound and the old fantasy that someone in my family would eventually choose decency without being forced. That fantasy is stubborn. It survives insults. It survives exclusions. It even survives public humiliation, because the heart keeps looking for the person it hoped was hiding under the behavior. I looked for that person in Dana for years. I looked for hesitation, regret, one private sentence that proved the cruelty had limits. What I found instead was calculation, not genius, calculation, the kind that depends on everyone else being embarrassed enough to stay quiet. I also learned that money changes shape depending on who is speaking. When they needed me small, $412,000 cash offer was just numbers, just practical, just what any reasonable family would do. When I questioned it, the same money became sacred. It became legacy, sacrifice, survival, duty, blood. The shift was so fast that it would have confused me if I had not written down the earlier version. That is why records matter. A record captures the first lie before the second one arrives dressed as principle. People sometimes ask why I did not expose everything sooner. The answer is simple. Exposure before proof gives a liar time to rehearse. It teaches them which part of the lie needs reinforcement. It lets them recruit witnesses and make you look unstable before anyone sees the documents. So I waited. Waiting did not mean doing nothing. Waiting meant making sure every page was legible, every copy was stored, and every person with authority at Buckeye Title heard the facts in the right order. That kind of restraint is exhausting. It is also the only reason the final room belonged to the truth instead of to whoever cried first. The small human moments were the ones that stayed with me most. The way the blue ribbon key felt heavier after the truth came out. The way a stranger lowered their voice when they realized the story was not gossip. The way my mother Evelyn became a full person again, the moment the room stopped treating my mother Evelyn as a problem to be solved. Even in a legal or financial fight, dignity is physical. You can see it return to a person's shoulders. You can hear it in the first complete sentence they speak after being interrupted for years. By the time I drove home, Dayton looked ordinary again. Cars moved through intersections. Someone was mowing a lawn. A woman carried groceries with a toddler pulling at her sleeve. Nothing outside had changed, and that almost made me angry. I had lived through an earthquake inside a room, and the world still had the nerve to look normal. Then I realized that was part of the gift. The world had not ended. The lie had. Those are different things. A family myth can collapse, and the sun can still hit the sidewalk. You can lose the illusion of belonging and still have somewhere to go. There is another part I could not have explained while it was happening. I was grieving two things at once. The obvious wound, and the old fantasy that someone in my family would eventually choose decency without being forced. That fantasy is stubborn. It survives insults. It survives exclusions. It even survives public humiliation, because the heart keeps looking for the person it hoped was hiding under the behavior. I looked for that person in Dana for years. I looked for hesitation, regret, one private sentence that proved the cruelty had limits. What I found instead was calculation, not genius, calculation. The kind that depends on everyone else being embarrassed enough to stay quiet. I also learned that money changes shape depending on who is speaking. When they needed me small, $412,000 cash offer was just numbers, just practical, just what any reasonable family would do. When I questioned it, the same money became sacred. It became legacy, sacrifice, survival, duty, blood. The shift was so fast that it would have confused me if I had not written down the earlier version. That is why records matter. A record captures the first lie before the second one arrives dressed as principle. People sometimes ask why I did not expose everything sooner. The answer is simple. Exposure before proof gives a liar time to rehearse. It teaches them which part of the lie needs reinforcement. It lets them recruit witnesses and make you look unstable before anyone sees the documents. So I waited. Waiting did not mean doing nothing. Waiting meant making sure every page was legible, every copy was stored, and every person with authority at Buckeye Title heard the facts in the right order. That kind of restraint is exhausting. It is also the only reason the final room belonged to the truth, instead of to whoever cried first. The small human moments were the ones that stayed with me most. The way the blue ribbon key felt heavier after the truth came out. The way a stranger lowered their voice when they realized the story was not gossip. The way my mother Evelyn became a full person again, the moment the room stopped treating my mother Evelyn as a problem to be solved. Even in a legal or financial fight, dignity is physical. You can see it return to a person's shoulders. You can hear it in the first complete sentence they speak, after being interrupted for years. The quietest part of this story happened in October. I came home one evening and found my mother on the porch shelling peas. The blue ribbon key hung by the door. She asked me to sit and said, "When the day comes that I truly cannot manage here, I want us to decide together before anybody else starts deciding for us." It was one of the most loving things anyone has ever said to me. The night before the final meeting, I did not sleep well. I sat at my kitchen table with the blue ribbon key near my right hand, and every copied page stacked in the order Martin Keene had advised. I put sticky notes on the sections that mattered. I checked the spelling of names. I checked timestamps. I checked whether any page had been folded in a way that could hide text in a scan. Then I made coffee I barely drank and watched the streetlights turn off one by one. There is a strange quiet before a public lie is corrected. It is not peace. It is not fear either. It is the body understanding that the years of swallowing words are about to end in a room where swallowing will no longer be required. A year later, we did choose together. After a winter fall made the stairs too much, we toured places slowly, asked hard questions, and let Martin review every contract. My mother chose a bright apartment not far from the old neighborhood. We sold the house the following spring for $448,000. The documents named the Mercer Family Living Trust. My mother and I signed together at Lena Ortiz's office. Dana was informed, not consulted. On the last day before closing, I walked room to room alone through Sycamore Lane, touched the banister my father had sanded by hand, and opened the den desk with the blue ribbon key one last time. Houses are not sacred because lumber is holy. They become sacred because memory lives there long enough to teach you who protected it and who priced it. When the decisive word finally appeared, it did not sound big enough for what it carried. Both. One plain word, no thunder, no music, no raised voice. But it rearranged ownership, authority, responsibility, and shame in less time than it takes to inhale. I watched faces change around the table as that word did what explanations had failed to do. It made the truth portable. It gave the quiet person something stronger than a speech. Dana had prepared for tears, accusations, maybe a scene. She had not prepared for a single word that could be verified by a third party at Buckeye Title. What did I learn? I learned that exploitation rarely introduces itself as cruelty. It arrives as efficiency, urgency, convenience, and the claim that one practical decision will solve everybody's stress. It borrows the language of care while reaching for control. I learned that elderly parents do not need children who merely love them. They need children who will read the paragraph on page 7. They need children who understand that being called difficult is sometimes the price of being trustworthy. And I learned that my father was right about one thing I used to resist. Some forms really are loaded guns, especially when put in front of a tired old woman by somebody who mistakes access for entitlement. Afterward, people wanted to talk about forgiveness because forgiveness is easier for outsiders than accountability. They asked whether I felt relieved. They asked whether the family could heal now. They asked whether I thought Dana had learned something. I did not know how to answer without sounding colder than I was. I had not survived all that to become a moral decoration for other people. Healing did not mean pretending the damage had been confusion. Forgiveness, if it ever came, would not be a shortcut back into access. The first constructive thing I did was boring and sacred. I updated every record, made duplicate copies, removed informal permissions, and placed the truth where it could not depend on my tired voice. That was the piece I trusted. There is another part I could not have explained while it was happening. I was grieving two things at once: the obvious wound and the old fantasy that someone in my family would eventually choose decency without being forced. That fantasy is stubborn. It survives insults. It survives exclusions. It even survives public humiliation, because the heart keeps looking for the person it hoped was hiding under the behavior. I looked for that person in Dana for years. I looked for hesitation, regret, one private sentence that proved the cruelty had limits. What I found instead was calculation, not genius, calculation. The kind that depends on everyone else being embarrassed enough to stay quiet. After the meeting, Martin advised us to make one more stop before going home. We drove to the county recorder's office and filed an affidavit of trustee authority, clarifying the current co-trusteeship and attaching notice that any attempted conveyance without both signatures was unauthorized. It was not glamorous. It was paperwork in fluorescent light. But I have learned that dignity is often defended in boring rooms by people willing to read everything before they sign. We then mailed a formal complaint packet to Northridge and a demand letter to Dana, requesting return of the lockbox keys, house copies, Cedar Pines reservation documents, and any records containing our mother's financial information. Martin also advised my mother on how to document her intent regarding future housing, so no one could claim confusion again. Dana called me 11 times that afternoon. I answered once. She cried first. Then she cursed. Then she said I had humiliated her in front of professionals. I told her she had humiliated herself in front of records. She said I always needed to win. I said, no, I need Mom not to be sold while I'm under anesthesia. Then I hung up. She did not call again for 3 days. The consequences kept unfolding after the adrenaline wore off. Cedar Pines refunded the deposit because the application packet had contained contradictory authorization signatures. Northridge withdrew the listing and, after Martin's letter, quietly waived any commission claim against our mother. Shelley sent one defensive email saying she had acted in good faith. Martin replied with attachments, and she never wrote again. Grant Morrow recovered his earnest money from escrow, but threatened Dana with suit over inspection and moving costs. Whether he followed through, I do not know. Dana, for the first time in her adult life, discovered that charm cannot refinance bad conduct once documents begin talking. What hurt most was not only what Dana did, it was how many people were ready to believe the version that required the least effort from them. If I was bitter, they did not have to investigate. If I was controlling, they did not have to admit someone vulnerable had been pressured. If I was jealous, poor, unstable, or dramatic, then the family could keep its image and still collect the benefit of my labor. That is the oldest trick in families like ours. Make the witness seem emotional before the evidence arrives. Reduce the woman carrying the records to a mood. I understood that strategy too late to avoid pain, but not too late to beat it. So I stopped trying to be understood by people who had invested in misunderstanding me. What I did next mattered more than what happened to Dana. I hired a geriatric care manager to assess my mother's actual needs. The report said what I had been saying for over a year. With medication support, meal prep help, and one downstairs bedroom conversion, she could remain safely at home for the time being. So we turned the den into a bedroom, installed a keypad lock, updated the trust binder, and created a one-page emergency summary for anyone who might ever need to understand our structure fast. Protection is not just saying no, it is building better yeses. Dana stayed away that summer. When she finally came by in August, she asked to speak with our mother. Later, my mother told me Dana had apologized in a way that still tried to explain itself. My mother did not put her back in charge of anything. She only told me, boundaries are not revenge. They're just the fence after you finally understand where the road is. Nobody spoke for about 4 seconds. It felt much longer. I could hear the air vent ticking. Shelley's pen slipped from her fingers and tapped the table. Grant Morrow leaned back in his chair, as if distance might change the language on the page. Dana looked first at me, then at my mother, then at Martin, and finally at Lena. I had seen my sister improvise charm hundreds of times. I had never seen it fail all at once. She said, "Fine, then Rachel can sign now." Her voice had gone thin. I folded my hands over the blue ribbon and said, "No." That was all. Dana laughed once, a short, unbelieving sound. "Rachel, stop punishing everybody because you're emotional." Martin placed another document on the table. It was our mother's signed revocation of Dana's authority to act or communicate on her behalf in financial and housing matters. He placed another. It was a letter disputing the contract on grounds of misrepresentation and lack of authority. Then Lena added one more problem. Buckeye Title could not ensure transfer under the present contract because the seller named in the agreement did not match titled ownership. Grant Morrow asked whether an amendment could fix it. Martin said perhaps in a different universe, where there had been informed consent, proper disclosure, full trustee participation, and no evidence of pressure exerted while the co-trustee responsible for daily care was hospitalized. "But not this morning," he said. Dana's color changed. She turned to our mother and said, "Mom, tell them you want to move. Tell them Rachel is manipulating you." My mother, who had spent years trying to keep peace by speaking softly, straightened in her chair and said something I had not heard from her with that much steadiness since my father died. She said, "I want to stay in my home until I choose to leave it. I did not understand what you put in front of me, and I do not want you selling my life in pieces." Dana stared at her, then at me. Then she said the ugliest thing she could think of in the moment. "You always wanted the house for yourself." She meant it as exposure. It sounded like panic. The practical details mattered, because practical details are where arrogant people get careless. A date in the wrong box. A name written as an individual when it should name a trust. A signature collected in a kitchen instead of witnessed where it should have been. A payment described as reimbursement when it was really pressure. A recording angle that shows the face someone later claimed was not present. These are not cinematic things. They are not the details people tell at parties. But when the moment arrives, they become louder than shouting. In the attempted sale of my mother's house, the emotional truth was obvious to me from the beginning. The legal truth needed the trust deed and the trustee certificate. And the legal truth had something grief and rage did not have. It could be handed across a table. I did not defend myself. I took the folded note in my father's handwriting from my purse and set it beside the trust certificate. "Dad knew you would say that someday," I told her. "That is why he made the structure he made." Martin did not need the note for law, but the room needed it for meaning. Dana looked at the handwriting and looked away. The collapse came in layers. Grant Morrow demanded to know whether Dana had authority to accept his earnest money and represent the property as clear for sale. Shelley from Northridge began insisting she had relied on Dana's representations and the signed contract. Lena explained that the wire would be returned pending release instructions, and that Buckeye Title would be documenting the dispute file. Martin stated, in the same tone he might use to order lunch, that any commission claim or expense demand should be directed away from Evelyn Mercer and toward the person who initiated unauthorized negotiations. Dana started blaming Shelley for not checking title more carefully. Shelley blamed Dana for calling herself the family representative. Grant blamed both. My mother sat very still and sipped water. I watched without satisfaction. Satisfaction is noisy. What I felt was something quieter, weight shifting back to where it belonged. There was one innocent person in that room, and it was not the buyer. It was the junior receptionist who had brought us water, heard the voices rise, and looked terrified that she had walked into something shameful. I remember thanking her when we left. Small kindness matters most in rooms where greed has been speaking loudly. Martin looked at me, then at my mother, and said in the gentlest voice I had ever heard from a lawyer, "Evelyn, you still have full right to decide where you live, but nobody can sell this house lawfully without Rachel's signature, so long as both of you remain co-trustees. And if anyone told you otherwise, that was false." My mother closed her eyes, not dramatically, just with fatigue. Then she said, "I do not want to move this week. I do not want strangers packing my dishes, and I do not want Dana handling my papers anymore." Martin nodded once. He opened his leather folder and began writing. The plan we formed was simple, because good plans often are. We would not confront Dana that afternoon beyond ordering the movers out and removing the lockbox. We would let the scheduled closing proceed to the point where the buyer, the agent, and Dana all had to sit in a room with the title company and face the actual chain of authority. In the meantime, Martin would send Buckeye Title and Northridge Realty written notice that any purported sale contract was disputed, that the property was trust-owned, and that no deed would be valid without both trustees' signatures. He would also prepare revocation documents removing Dana from any caregiving or financial role our mother had informally allowed, and draft a new, narrower power of attorney, naming me and, as backup, Martin's firm, for document review only. My mother signed those papers that evening, after he read each line to her slowly. I signed as co-trustee. Then Martin used my father's blue ribbon key to open the fireproof box in the den, so we could compare originals with copies. There is something almost holy about old papers doing exactly what they were intended to do. The next morning was closing day. Dana did not know Martin had spoken to Buckeye Title. She did not know Grant Morrow's wire had been flagged pending trustee verification. She did not know Buckeye's senior closer, Lena Ortiz, had reviewed the title commitment after Martin's letter and pulled the recorded trust deed from the county database. She did not know, because people who move on arrogance rarely imagine anyone else is also moving. Before we left for the title office, I sat at my mother's kitchen table and drank weak coffee while she buttered half a piece of toast and left most of it untouched. My incision hurt, my body wanted bed rest, my mind was sharper than it had been in days. Dana texted me at 8:12 a.m., "Please don't embarrass Mom today, just sign and let this be done." I stared at the message for a full 10 seconds before forwarding it to Martin. Then I put my phone face down and tied the blue ribbon around my wrist like a bracelet. If you have ever waited through the last quiet hour before the truth lands on someone who has been lying, you know how strange it feels. Your pulse is high, but your face gets calmer. That was me walking into Buckeye Title at 9:03 a.m. Dana was already there in a white suit, seated beside Shelley from Northridge, with a man in his 50s I recognized from the weekend photo as Grant Morrow. He had the expensive, detached patience of a person used to buying inconvenience out of his way. Dana saw me and smiled as if she had expected resistance but not strategy. Then she saw my mother enter behind me holding Martin's arm. Then she saw Martin himself. The smile changed shape. The conference room was too cold. Someone had set out a tray of bottled water and dry pastries nobody touched. Lena Ortiz introduced herself, sat down, and arranged 3 folders in front of her. Dana started talking immediately. She said we were all here because emotions had run high after my surgery, but our mother still wanted the sale and it was important not to delay. Grant Morrow said he had movers scheduled and school enrollment deadlines for his nephew, a detail I later learned was fiction. Shelley said everything had been disclosed and that signatures could be cleaned up quickly. Martin raised one finger and said, "Before we discuss feelings, let us discuss title." He slid a copy of the recorded deed across the table, then the certificate of trust, then the page from Article 4 with the conveyance clause highlighted. Dana glanced once and said, "Too fast, We already know Rachel needs to sign. That's why we're here, Martin said. No, Miss Cole. You are here because you represented this property, as if Evelyn Mercer individually had authority to sell it, and as if Rachel Mercer's participation was a formality. It is not a formality. It is a legal requirement. There is no conveyance without it. There never was. Lena then read one sentence aloud from the trust certificate, in the steady voice of a woman who had read many unpleasant truths in small rooms. Any sale, lease exceeding 1 year, mortgage, or transfer of the residence commonly known as 214 Sycamore Lane shall require the written signatures of both acting trustees, Evelyn Mercer and Rachel Mercer, during their joint lifetimes and periods of legal capacity. By then, Martin Keene had become the person I called when my own judgment needed a wall behind it. Everyone needs one person like that. Not someone who flatters you, not someone who automatically takes your side. Someone who can read the room, read the documents, and tell you where emotion ends and leverage begins. As our family attorney, Martin Keene understood the difference between suspicion and evidence. When I told the story the first time, I expected questions that would make me feel foolish. Instead, I heard pages turning, then that measured silence professionals use when something is worse than they want to say too quickly. Do not warn them yet, Martin Keene said. Let the paperwork finish revealing the lie. That sentence became the rail I held while everything else moved. Sunday, May 18th, my neighbor Louise stopped by with soup and called me from her car afterward. She said there had been 2 showings, an inspection-looking visit, and a lockbox on the front door. She also said Dana had moved the blue hydrangea planter because buyers like a cleaner entrance. That told me Dana was not improvising under stress. She was staging my mother's life. Louise said, "Honey, your sister is acting like the widow's already dead." I wrote that down too. Monday, May 19th. I was discharged at 10:20 a.m. with lifting restrictions, antibiotics, and instructions to return immediately if the fever came back. I drove straight home, changed clothes, picked up the blue ribbon key from my kitchen drawer where I had left my spare, and went to Sycamore Lane. That was when I saw the sold sign. That was when Dana told me the house was no longer mine to worry about. That was when my mother, still seated by the window, said my name in the small, frightened voice she only used when she had said yes to something she did not understand. The buyer was scheduled to wire the balance in 2 days. Movers had been hired to start sorting. Dana had already reserved a 1-bedroom suite at Cedar Pines and put down a deposit from what she called the expected proceeds. She had even ordered printed change of address labels. I asked her one question in front of everybody. I said, "Did Martin review the transfer documents?" Dana looked annoyed and said, "We don't need Martin for every single life decision. Mom has capacity. She signed the listing, the purchase agreement, and the seller disclosures. Shelley took care of the rest." The movers paused. The woman wrapping china kept folding paper. My mother stared at the carpet. I nodded once and said, "All right." Then I took my mother upstairs despite the pain in my side and closed her bedroom door. She began apologizing before I even sat down. That is what hurt most. Not the sale, the apology. She told me Dana had said I would be angry because I was emotionally attached, and because I did not want our mother to have nicer care. Dana had brought Shelley from Northridge Realty and a man named Grant Morrow, who was buying for his family, but maybe as an investment if plans changed. They told my mother the market was peaking, and the offer might disappear if she waited. Dana said my hospital stay proved the current arrangement was unstable. They put papers in front of her over 2 afternoons. She signed because Dana said all that remained was a routine signature from Rachel later, and that I had verbally agreed from the hospital. That lie was useful. It made my mother think the conflict was not over the sale itself, only timing. There were warnings long before the day everything broke open. I just did not call them warnings yet. I called them bad moods. I called them pressure. I called them family being family, because that phrase lets people survive things they should have named earlier. Dana began with jokes, then suggestions, then corrected versions of history. She would say, "That is not how it happened," with such clean certainty that weaker witnesses would retreat. She tested which details I would challenge and which I would let pass to keep the room calm. Every time I chose peace, she mistook it for surrender. Every time I documented something instead of confronting her, she mistook it for fear. That was useful. It let me see the pattern in full before she realized I had stopped arguing and started building a file. I asked whether Dana had shown her the trust binder. My mother frowned and said Dana told her the trust was old paperwork from when Dad worried too much. Then my mother did something that still makes my chest tighten when I remember it. She reached into her nightstand and took out a folded note in my father's handwriting. It was only a grocery list on the front, but on the back he had written, years earlier, in case he forgot to say it out loud. Blue key with Rachel. House decisions require both of you. That is for your protection, not her burden. He had written it during one of his medication fog days, probably after Martin left the house. My mother said she had forgotten about the note until that morning when Dana kept saying I was just being possessive. She handed the note to me with both hands. That was the moment I stopped thinking about stopping a bad sale and started thinking about ending Dana's access. I called Martin from my mother's bedroom. He answered with, "I'm on my way. No questions asked." Under an hour later, he was sitting at my mother's vanity, reading copies of the documents Dana had left behind. Shelley had been thorough in the wrong places and lazy in the important ones. The listing agreement named Evelyn Mercer as seller, not the Mercer Family Living Trust. The purchase contract did the same. The property disclosures were signed by our mother individually. There was a limited power of attorney attached for facilitating real estate matters, but it had not been notarized correctly, and, more importantly, it could not authorize Dana to convey trust property she did not control. The preliminary title commitment from Buckeye Title, tucked in the back, clearly listed owner as Mercer Family Living Trust, dated June 8, 2011. Dana had either never read it or assumed nobody else would. Friday, May 16. My mother sounded tired when I called. She said people had been in and out of the house, measuring things. When I asked who, she said Dana's friend Shelley had brought a photographer, because they said pictures help with planning. My incision throbbed so hard I could barely hold the phone. I asked if she had signed anything. There was a pause long enough to make my heart speed up. Then she said, "Just some forms Dana said were for getting information." My mother had always been careful with strangers and careless with daughters. That is a dangerous combination in old age. I asked whether the forms were blank when she signed them. She said, very quietly, one of them didn't have all the boxes filled in. Dana said they just needed my okay to talk. I thanked her. I told her not to sign another page until I got home. Then I called Martin Keene. The thing about the blue ribbon key is that it did not look powerful. It looked sentimental, almost foolish, like something a woman would keep because she could not let go. That was why the others underestimated it. They saw an object. I saw a chain of custody. I saw dates, hands, promises, and the exact moment someone older than me had realized the family needed a safeguard more than it needed another speech about unity. When I touched it, I was not touching nostalgia. I was touching proof that someone had planned for the day when a loud person would try to turn exhaustion into consent. The object was small enough to fit in my hand, but the meaning behind it was larger than any room where I had ever been humiliated. Martin was 67, white-haired, slow-spoken, and impossible to rattle. He had handled my parents' trust, my divorce settlement, and one ugly dispute with a roofing contractor. He answered on the second ring. I said, "Martin, Dana is trying to sell Mom's house while I'm in the hospital." He did not ask me if I was sure. He said, "I was expecting this call." Then he explained why. A buyer's agent had contacted his office that morning, asking for a copy of the trustee certificate for the Mercer property because the family wanted a fast closing. Martin's assistant refused and told them to request documentation through both trustees. No one did. Instead, an hour later, his office received by fax a limited power of attorney, allegedly signed by my mother on Wednesday, authorizing Dana to assist with real estate communications. Martin said the form was sloppy, overly broad in one paragraph, and useless in another, and did not give Dana authority to convey trust property. He also reminded me, in the same calm voice he used when discussing weather, that the house was not owned by Evelyn Mercer individually. It was owned by the Mercer Family Living Trust, and under Article 4, Any conveyance required the signatures of both acting trustees, Evelyn Mercer and me. I felt the first true wave of relief then. Not victory, relief. A locked door is not the same thing as a stop sign, but it slows a thief. Martin told me to do 3 things. First, ask the hospital for written confirmation that I had been admitted, and under post-surgical restriction, so no one could later claim I had refused to participate in a voluntary sale meeting. Second, preserve every text, voicemail, visitor log, and discharge instruction. Third, do not confront Dana until we knew how far she had already gone. People like your sister talk more when they think they are ahead, he said. Let her build her own trail. If you are listening to this and thinking I should have driven straight from the hospital to the house and thrown everyone out, I understand the impulse. I had it too. But outrage often cleans up the other person's mess for them. Calm lets the mess stay visible, so I stayed still. I asked questions. I let Dana believe my recovery had made me soft. Saturday, May 17th. Dana texted that a family friend investor had offered $412,000 cash with a 14-day close and a temporary occupancy window, and that our mother could move to Cedar Pines by June. I texted back, "No decisions until I'm home." She replied, "Mom already made the decision," then sent a photo of our mother holding a pen over what looked like a purchase agreement. The angle showed just enough to make me feel excluded and powerless. I forwarded the text to Martin. He called 10 minutes later and said the price was under market by at least $25,000, given recent sales on our street, which told him this was either a rush sale to somebody Dana knew or a buyer counting on a distressed family. He asked whether Dana had ever shown hostility toward me being co-trustee. I said yes. He said, "Then there's your motive. If she convinces your mother to sign a contract and gets you painted as the obstructive daughter, she can push for emergency action later. Not on the law, but on pressure." He then told me something that became the hinge of the whole case. Northridge Realty had ordered preliminary title on the property that morning. The title report would show the trust as owner. If Dana moved forward anyway, that meant she was counting on speed, confusion, or intimidation to overcome the missing signature. Martin said, "Let her get to the closing table. That's where people discover what they failed to read." After he died, I became the one who did the practical things. I paid toward the roof, installed the walk-in shower and handrails, set up automatic tax payments, and moved a recliner downstairs when the stairs wore our mother out. None of that made me a saint. It made me nearby. Dana came in bursts with big ideas, and liked saying, "Rachel keeps Mom in a museum." What she meant was that I did not let her turn the house into a listing. The first serious threat appeared the week after my mother forgot to switch off a saucepan and scorched the bottom. Nothing caught fire. The kitchen just smelled burnt for 2 days. Dana arrived with printed brochures from assisted living facilities and spread them across the dining room table like cruise packages. The cheapest one was $6,300 a month, plus medication management. The nicer one she liked was $8,400. She talked about socialization, dining services, and relief for me. When my mother said she wanted to stay home as long as possible, Dana smiled and said, "Of course. But at some point, stubbornness becomes expensive." Then she looked at the hallway, then the staircase, then the front window, and I knew she was seeing marketable features, not our mother's life. By the time I landed in the hospital, Dana had been laying groundwork for months. She took our mother to tour a senior apartment complex and came back with glossy pamphlets and a filled-out interest card. She called a handyman without asking me and got a bid to repaint the living room to freshen it up. She kept asking where the original trust binder was, pretending she needed it to understand the broader plan. I told her every time that Martin Keene held copies and that was enough. My mistake was assuming that being denied direct access would slow her down. I was admitted to St. Vincent on a Tuesday evening in May after what I thought was stomach pain turned out to be an infected gallbladder with complications. My surgery was the next morning. It was not life-threatening, but I was in no shape to sit in a lawyer's office or supervise anyone. From the emergency room bed, I texted Dana and asked her to stay with our mother overnight because my neighbor Louise could only cover until 9. Dana answered in 30 seconds. "Of course. Don't worry about anything. I'll handle Mom. That sentence should have chilled me more than it did. Wednesday, May 14th. I went into surgery at 7:10 a.m. Louise dropped a tote bag at the hospital around noon with my phone charger and fresh clothes. She said Dana had arrived at my mother's house before breakfast with pastries and unusual energy. That afternoon, Dana texted me a photo of my mother smiling in the kitchen. We're fine. Rest. In the background, barely visible if you were not looking for it, was a stack of mail from the desk by the fridge missing from its usual place. I noticed. I filed it away. Wednesday night, still groggy on pain medication, I missed 2 calls from an unknown number. The voicemail, which I did not hear until the next day, was from a woman named Shelley at Northridge Realty, asking whether both family decision-makers would be available to discuss timing. I had never heard of Northridge Realty. Thursday, May 15th, Dana visited my hospital room in a cream blazer and carried tulips like she was stopping by a baby shower. She kissed my forehead, asked about my pain level, and spent exactly 90 seconds discussing my recovery before she said, "Mom's doing better than expected with the idea of downsizing." I remember the word because it landed in the room like broken glass. I asked what idea. Dana said she had a friend in real estate who could do a quick valuation, just so Mom knows her options. I told her no valuation was happening while I was in the hospital, and no one was entering the house without my knowledge. Dana smiled and said, "Rachel, you are on morphine. You need to let other adults solve things." Then she asked where Dad used to keep the old survey paperwork, because buyers sometimes like lot details. That was the moment I knew she was no longer circling the possibility of a sale. She was in motion. I did not argue. I asked for water. I let her talk. She mentioned that our mother was finally seeing how much house is a burden. She mentioned 2 different numbers, 400,000 and 425, as if they had already been discussed. She mentioned getting my mother positioned for a smooth move. Before she left, she adjusted my blanket and said, "Try not to stress. I'm making this easier for everyone." After she was gone, I opened the Notes app on my phone and wrote down every phrase I could remember, including the time she entered the room, the color of the folder in her hand, and the fact that she had asked about the survey. Documenting is not dramatic, it is oxygen. The moment her mask slipped all the way was 3 months before my hospital stay. We were in my mother's kitchen. I was sorting her prescriptions into a weekly organizer. Dana was leaning against the counter in a camel coat, talking to somebody on speakerphone about an open house. Our mother asked if I could look at the furnace invoice that had come in the mail. Dana muted her call and said, with a smile that barely moved her mouth, "Mom, you always run things by Rachel because she likes to feel useful. Let me handle the money questions. She's the daughter who folds towels. I'm the one who knows how assets work." My mother looked at me. I looked at Dana. I snapped the lid shut on the pillbox and said, "Then explain why you wanted Mom to sign a power of attorney without showing it to her attorney." Dana shrugged and said, "Because not everything has to become an emotional federal case." That was the day I stopped believing her ambition was casual. If you have ever been called controlling when you were really the person keeping an elderly parent safe, then you understand why I kept records and never let that blue ribbon key leave my purse. My father, Frank Mercer, gave me that key in the spring of 2011, 6 months before he died. He had tied it to a faded strip of blue ribbon cut from one of my mother's old sewing boxes, because he said bare keys got lost in drawers, and family papers got stolen by disorder, long before they got stolen by thieves. The key opened the bottom right drawer of his roll-top desk in the den, and, inside that drawer, a fireproof metal box. I still remember the smell of Old Spice, machine oil, and cedar when he opened it. He had emphysema by then. Every breath sounded expensive. He told me to sit down because he did not have enough air to repeat himself. My mother was in the garden clipping dead roses. Dana was in Florida with a boyfriend whose name I no longer remember. Dad slid a red folder across the desk and said, "Your mother trusts everybody when she's tired. You don't. That is not a character flaw. That is why I need you on paper with her." What he had done, with our family attorney Martin Keene, was create the Mercer Family Living Trust after his second hospitalization. The trust held the house at 214 Sycamore Lane, a modest investment account, and the small savings reserve my parents kept for home repairs and emergency care. The trust was revocable while either parent was alive, and after my father's death, my mother and I became co-trustees. Not beneficiaries, trustees. Dana and I were equal remainder beneficiaries after our mother's death, but while our mother lived, the trust assets were to be used for her care, her housing, and her needs. Martin had explained in plain English that this structure prevented exactly the kind of pressure older widows sometimes face when one child starts treating a living parent's property like an inheritance already earned. The house deed had been transferred into the trust years before. My mother signed as grantor. My father signed. The county recorded it. The trust certificate was updated after Dad died. The clause Martin read twice, because Dad made him read it twice, said that any sale, mortgage, or conveyance of trust real estate required the signatures of both acting trustees, so long as both were living and competent. Dad looked at me over his oxygen tubing and said, "I am not making you owner. I am making you brake pads." That was his phrase. Brake pads. He said Dana was not evil, just easily seduced by convenience and appearances, and that convenience around money was dangerous. I did not like hearing it, but he was not wrong. The house then was valued around $230,000. The roof needed work. The upstairs carpet smelled like the dog we had buried 5 years earlier. It was not some grand estate. It was simply the only place my mother still slept well. Dad knew memory and safety are not always the same thing, but dignity lives where a person still recognizes the hallway at night. The public version of our family looked kinder than the private one. People saw holiday cards, clean clothes, polite voices, and the kind of gatherings where nobody raised a hand because everyone knew how to do damage without touching skin. But inside that polished surface, power moved through favors, guilt, and inheritance language. Whoever controlled access to my mother Evelyn controlled sympathy. Whoever controlled the story controlled money. Whoever looked most composed in front of neighbors was assumed to be telling the truth. I had spent years watching Dana benefit from that rule. She could turn a request into a rescue mission, and a selfish act into a sacrifice if she had an audience. I could not. My strength was slower. I noticed when words changed. I noticed when a sentence that used to be about care became a sentence about ownership. I noticed when concern started arriving with forms attached.